sometimes the most important conversation is the one you're having with yourself. But just what I noticed was, folks tend to fall back on their training rather than rise to occasions.
People develop this sense of what I should do when I'm in combat. And a lot of times, in my case, I was out there with the companies as needed. If they needed support, that was my job. You don't hear a lot of stories like that.
That even when we had some very bad days with high amounts of casualties, there was this sense of still calm, that we are still in control, and that in itself is a leadership attribute that isn't. I don't know that it's taught. It's probably more caught.
Of our sergeant major, he had done a lot of talking with. He was a drill instructor background, which you always love working with those guys.
Some of my best bosses, they knew what my wife's name was. They knew how many kids I had. They knew where I was from. They knew more than just my rank and my name.
They've been a manager, but they've never had somebody really talk to them about how to be a leader. What would you tell them?
I think the path to being a good leader is deciding that you want to be one. For other, nothing shows you care like being there.
Yeah, trust, the way I explain it to people is if people don't trust you, they don't tell you things. So if you're fine making decisions with a incorrect understanding of what's going on, then don't worry about it. All right, here we are again. This is the second episode of the 2-5 Leadership Podcast. I'm Mike Targus. I was the Battalion Executive Officer, or XO, of 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines on our 2004 deployment to Ramadi, Iraq. And we started this podcast to get the story out of that deployment and the guys in it, and also to help anybody that is listening develop themselves as a leader. If you haven't, as we were talking earlier, if you haven't been down a road like that, there's no reason you can't get some of the benefit from the guys that have. Today we got Chris Tsirlis. Chris was our communications platoon commander in the battalion. The battalion is about 1,200 guys. I think if I remember right, we had about 1,200 guys, and pretty big platoon. He'll get into that a little bit. And Chris did, I think you said 32 years in the Corps. Got out a couple years ago as a colonel. Started out as on the Yellow Footprints. Did you go to Parris Island, Chris?
What? San
Diego. Okay. And so he's got damn near all of his life invested in the Corps, but he's been out a couple years. He's currently the vice president of business development, Airbus. And there's a part of Airbus I want you to explain, Chris. But yeah, we're real glad to have you. And our mission here, like I said, is to tell the story, but help people develop themselves as leaders and give our guys, this just came to me, but give our guys a voice here to tell their story as well. So over to you, Chris. Maybe tell everybody a little bit about your career, about you as a man, as a Marine, as a family man, as a Christian. I saw in your notes. That's great to see. Let's hear it.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity to, first off, see you again across the digital landscape.
It's been a while.
It's always an honor and privilege to reacquaint and to reconnect with mentors like yourself. And up front, you were always a great mentor to me personally.
Thank you.
Which meant a hell of a lot during some stressful times, that's for sure. I'd like to say that my life has been very unremarkable, in maybe in many ways, but at the same time, I feel like I've had a pretty traditional career. I started out enlisted, did 10 years as an infantryman, and then earned my commission and became by choice, a communications officer. Yeah, there was a reason why I knew how to do range cards and be able to lay in a machine gun when I showed up to 2-5. I felt more at home being a grunt than I certainly did being a communications officer. So, but
yeah, I remember that.
I got, some opportunities to do some really neat things. Certainly after 2-5, got to go to grad school, got to go to Naval Postgraduate School, got a chance to work at headquarters Marine Corps, doing a lot of different strategic billets. And then an opportunity to work at a COB battalion, run the battalion for an operational deployment to Afghanistan. Moved on over to special operations over at JSOC, Joint Special Operations, over to Joint Special Operations Command over at Fort Bragg, and worked as a J6 Ops guy, J6 forward, funny enough, for one of the task forces. And then got selected for command for recruiting, which is a blessing and a curse, so to speak. 3 years running and gunning off 4 states in the Midwest, and we could get into that and what that meant. And then sometimes overseas and in Okinawa, and then selected for command of Comp Squadron 28, where I finished up my career. And so I tried to put everything I had in me into each one of those gigs, and came out the other side, so to speak, with my family intact, and my kids somehow survived that, and I consider that probably the biggest strategic win out of all of it. So
Yeah, no doubt. And your son's a lieutenant, is that right?
he is. It's funny. I never really pushed him into the Corps. But I want to think that I set all the guideposts for him to follow, all the way
Yeah.
points to go. But yeah, he's over at Victor 28 right now, golf company, first
Oh,
platoon,
wow.
and he's up in Norway as we speak, going through a cold weather package out there and earning his stripes as a second lieutenant.
Wow. Second lieutenant. I was a second lieutenant in cold weather training. Those are the times where you really learn a lot. Just to highlight, you mentioned the family. I mean, I know Michelle and Wendy became really good friends back in 25, but to have everybody with you through the whole thing is a real blessing. Glad. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, certainly. There's a whole other side of the equation when it comes to my career. Helped me really kind of gave me that firm footing every day of being able to charge forward and serve the Marines at the best that I could. So I really owe her a lot. She's hard. She's hard as they come, man. It's funny now that we've been out for a few years, and if anything of like complex or maybe some high stress nature comes around, she quickly reminds me that I'm the Marine spouse, right? And kind of puts me back in my place. Madeline is graduating this May from the University of Arizona. She's getting a marketing degree. But funny enough, Mike, last November, she came to me and she says, "Hey, Dad, I'm thinking about serving my nation." And so, funny enough, now we talked about branches, of course, and I'm a little biased, such as you, but it looks like she's kind of going down the Air Force officer path right now. So, we'll see how that goes. We're really excited and real proud.
That sounds like a great option. I'm sure that she would learn a ton of things. So take us into, you've been out how many years, and then what's your path been since you've been out?
Last day of active duty was February of 22. So it's
Okay.
going on 3 years now. It's kind of gone by in a blink. Um, you think that in your mind, as you know, Mike, you kind of go through this whole thing thinking that retirement is going to be one thing, and you find yourself
Yeah.
kind of another set of orders, so to speak. Now with a new company jersey and logo behind you, and a new set of culture that you've got to adapt to. Transition for me, and I always hate to say this, but it was actually very good.
Okay.
That's where you always hear about these tough, folks having a tough time finding their place in the world. For me personally, I went through that too. That everything that I got taught in the Marine Corps and that I would espouse even myself, sometimes the most important conversation is the one you're having with yourself. And once you kind of take charge of that conversation in your head, you realize that you don't have to beat yourself up so much when you may not be hitting the mark, or you may not be in, always the top dog. Some of the pressures that you put on, certainly as Marine officers, that you put on yourself to be excelling in everything that you do. And so, but that over time, that changed, and I found myself to be, just fine, over a period of time. And I think what helped me, and we can maybe get into this, is helping other vets transition, much like you've done. When I was at my first company out of Marine Corps, I kind of took that on as a way of my own transition, is helping folks make that leap, and that I think
Mm.
that helped me a lot.
Um, I was talking to our mutual friend, Dave Godwin, and speaking of your first job when you got out, wasn't quite what you were looking for. How did that go? The first, right out of the gates, because it just kind of from my experience, I got out in 2013 and I went into a project manager job with Siemens, who you may have some dealings with, I don't, with Airbus maybe, but we had a water treatment. I went from being a battalion commander, a lot of autonomy, a lot of responsibility, to being a project manager, and I had mechanical contractors screaming at me on the phone about the projects and all kinds of things. I used to describe it as in a lot of ways harder than combat because, like you're saying, the enemy is yourself, and when you have a great team around you, which is kind of why you and I are here right now talking, uh, you rely on each other and
Yeah.
you're not in it by yourself. But one of my observations is in the Marine Corps, or probably all services, hopefully still all services, uh, it's kind of a pejorative term to say, to approach things, uh, as they pertain to you only, like your self-interest. Yeah, so me and my and I. In fact, you can testify, you get crushed in boot camp, if you even think of doing that. Maybe you did. But when you get out, it's the opposite. What I came to realize was that's okay. That's what most people's paradigm is. And people are living their lives and they're not deploying and they're not putting their lives on the line, and at least in the way the 2-5 guys did. But yeah, what was that first shock, that cold water in the face job like?
Yeah, so my first role was, with Microsoft, this little known software
Yeah.
company. That transition was probably about 180 degrees from the Marine Corps. So if I was to pick a company, Google, Microsoft, Meta, Silicon Valley, West Coast vibe, and then you got the United States Marine Corps. But I would say you you quickly find out that your rank and position in the service is of no consequence, in a corporation like that. I mean, and to the extent where I think my first meeting, not with my immediate boss, but my boss's boss, and and I was part of a classified cloud infrastructure program. Um, she she ghosted me about 3 times for a one-on-one, like introductory one-on-one. She just never showed. And I thought to myself, well, this is the most unprofessional shit that I've ever seen in my life. And finally I had a chance to pin her down. And I kind of told her that, I kind of dug into her a little bit on that issue. And I could tell like that wasn't something that you do in corporate Americans, man. Like you
Oh, wow.
most people wouldn't speak up in that type of environment. And so it's little things like that where you realize that you are in just a different pitch, right? You're in a different playing field. You just got to learn the rules, and you got to learn to divest yourself. At least for me, I had to learn to divest myself from my ego. And I had probably as prideful and as much ego as any other Marine. When they take you through command school, you go through your course for command, and they always talk about get rid of your ego and humility and that right runs supreme. I've never really believed in that. I was just not a guy who thrived on, well, at least I looked at humility as not being something the way that it was described to me. I believed in not necessarily being egotistical, but being, be, being of a certain mindset to accomplish certain objectives and being confident about that and having confidence in my abilities to discern that. So I found myself kind of just going through those mental gymnastics on stripping that away so that I could be adaptable to my new environment. And that just took some time. I knew it would, but it took some time.
What maybe yeah, let me go there with you for a second. So I think what I heard you say is, in the Marine Corps, you have a mission, and you maybe your mission is to deploy to Iraq and do a combat deployment, or maybe your mission is to, it sounded like you had, well, in recruiting, which for people who don't know, Marine Corps recruiting, that's a highly selective job. It's very stressful. You have goals of numbers of people and types of people with skill sets and backgrounds that you got to bring in. The guys I know on recruiting duty, it just never goes away. And I'm sure you're smiling. I mean, I can see where it wouldn't. But when you get out, or when you got out, it sounds to me like what I heard you say with regard to humility is it's not all about you and what you do,
But
and even if you have people working for you, is getting that job done to a T every time. It sounds, at least like in Microsoft, you got to have people around you feeling good about things,
right.
which is not something that you and I grew up needing to consider.
As
Maybe that's the
much,
only way to say
as
it.
much, like
As much.
morale could be driven a couple different ways, right? It could be driven by because of you or in spite of you, right? Like, I hate that son of a bitch. We're gonna just get this thing done, or I love that son of a bitch. Let's get this thing done. And in I noticed that the level of attention given to people's feelings in the civilian world was to were to a much greater degree than mission accomplishment. And so, in fact, that in many cases was the mission, was more of that than anything. And so for somebody who's results driven, now don't get me wrong. I mean, business is business. They've got to make money. They got to turn a profit. But in the Marine Corps, you have, your profit is it's a different P&L, so to speak. People are your profit in many cases. Obviously mission accomplishment. Um, in business, it may not just be that. And so what I found myself is just kind of going through that transformation. But what I would tell you, and I would tell everybody on this podcast or whoever may listen to this, is that, the things that you learn about being adaptable, good old MCDP1, uh, surfaces and gaps, friction, all of those things I would kind of fall back on as to, hey, this is just a different environment in which I've got to kind of fight through. Find what that gap is and exploit it at pace and do it ethically. You're not trying to roll people, but I found myself really drawing from those years of experience, trying to apply it to a military model, or in my case, a command and control model. And just adjusting and tweaking those concepts to a business environment. And
Like, look at yourself.
yeah,
Yeah, look at yourself and say, what would I have wanted my first boss, or maybe my current boss, to know before I got there about my kind of person?
yeah, I think that um, having a clear, direct tasking would have been useful. I would think if you're hiring a major, lieutenant colonel, even a senior enlisted service member, realize they come from a world where it's a very black, I won't say totally black and white, but it's a much more concrete, definitive way of asking. And I think in the civilian world, they look at that as being maybe a little bit threatening or toxic, where I would have really have appreciated that. Like, hey, Chris, here, almost like your bill of accomplishments. Here are the things that I need you to do. These are the things I would have to. I found myself drawing that out from my boss and really having
Mhm.
to claw that information on what were their information requirements, what was most important, and and I think that's probably some bit of advice I'd give somebody hiring somebody from the service, is that's kind of the environment they're coming into.
Yeah, I've had a couple incidents where people have thrown back to me that, in the military, you just tell people what to do and they do it, which is not exactly what you're saying, but I think, it's a pretty common perception. I think the certainty thing for me, that's central to my experience as well. I've seen executives that I think are really successful, and what makes them successful is the ability to do that and then follow up on that to say, I made a post about this pretty recently where a good executive, they almost seem like they never forget anything. So you'd be given a presentation, be going over the business results for the quarter or something. You say, okay, next quarter, we're going to have a goal to do whatever it is. And then you don't see this person for a couple months or 2, 3 months.
Mhm.
And then seemingly they just pull this information out of the air. So I think the certainty on a daily basis, I agree. I've seen different levels of that. I think generally my experience has been kind of like yours, which is you don't get a lot of that intense supervision. Sure, at some companies, I'm sure you do. But I would say what I've seen is the really successful, maybe the senior leaders know how to follow up on maybe minimal requirements like that. So you don't have to do it every day. So you're at Airbus now. So I'm trying to Microsoft. I can only assume you had maybe less veterans. Is Airbus different? Do you have a larger military or veteran group that you're working with?
Yeah, yeah. So it's funny. So when I was at Microsoft, I was a product manager there. So I ran a mod sim geospatial team. But in that, I had subcontractors working for me, which is not uncommon in tech companies. So about 20 software developers helping write the code for platform. Kind of had a PM working for me, an infrastructure guy working for me, and a whole association of folks in marketing and legal and all those kinds of things. And in there, I would say the density of vets was probably between 5 and 10%. There, and never anybody who kind of ran the distance, so to speak. At Airbus, it's probably around 30 or 40% are vets. And I think it has a little bit more to do with the satellite industry. Um, it's much more mechanical engineering, RF engineering, things of that nature. And I think, I don't know, systems engineering, and it just seems to have drawn a lot more of a veteran pool. And we have a good mix of all the services that at least have, they either did, a full full run or, 5 to 10 years on average out of that 30%. So it's a good mix.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It creates a little bit different environment when you're speaking a little bit of the same language. Maybe shift gears a little bit here. So the deployment that we were on, maybe just give some generics on that. We all deployed the advanced party. I think you were with me on the advanced party, if I remember, or did you? Yeah. So we went. I believe we're there August 2004, and we had a 7 month deployment. I guess you and I we were there 8 months or close to it, right? So Ramadi, you hear more and more about it, and I was looking at our exchange earlier. You hear more and more about it, but it really is one of those historic times in the Marine Corps, with the war as a whole. A lot of SEALs out there talking about Ramadi, and I remember, just to give everybody kind of a visual, and I'll put a picture up on the screen about it. But densely populated, urban. It's a city. So I remember when 60 Minutes crew came through, Colonel Newman, who I just talked to pretty recently, about the size of, yeah, there you go. On your
There you
wall
go.
there, there's a good picture of it. Yeah. About the population of Kansas City, I think it had 300,000 people. I don't know how many were there, or I'm sure it was less, people leaving when we were there. And we took over for 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. And these guys got in there, and I believe it was April where the city kind of exploded. Al Qaeda came in there, got everybody organized, and then it was fighting every day. So we had a 7 month deployment. We had about 1,200 guys in the city with us. Just to clarify for everybody, we had little, what we call firm bases spread throughout the city, which would be a kind of a fortified area, a couple buildings with some barriers and things like that, machine gun posts, in contact every day. I try to remember before we deployed what I was thinking, and to me, I just don't remember taking it with the level of what are we getting ourselves into. That in retrospect, I think I might have done that. We knew that 2-4 was in there fighting. They lost some guys through that deployment. We knew about that. We saw the wounded guys coming home back at San Mateo, Camp San Mateo. But I don't know about you, but before the deployment, I have a tough time remembering what was going through my mind before going out there. Do you remember that feeling at all? Or
Yeah, I do. I remember specifically it was a little bit of a roller coaster because as you remember, Mike, when we got home from OIF-1, I mean, hell, we had a victory parade down in Oceanside. Um,
yeah,
and like many others, I thought that was it. I thought this was the, post, Desert Storm victory kind of parades and 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 very quickly, I remember standing duty, regimental duty one night and receiving some calls about KIAs.
yeah,
And for me, that put a very sharp edge on the reality of the situation while 2-4 was deployed. And and quickly, I think the tenor and tone of our battalion quickly shifted based on the reports coming from 2-4, knowing that we were going to eventually, relieve them. And so I remember it being a little bit of an emotional roller coaster. Not so much of a from the battalion do that to us, but just as the reports coming in, and then thinking in my mind, if we're going back, this is going to be different. This because at the tail end of 2003, as you recall, I was a rifle platoon commander, and we were doing a lot of patrolling outside of Baghdad, and I was in this town called Mula Fayed, it's like Yusufia, which was it was pretty much the start of the IED fight there. Towards it was Task Force Scorpion. I was part of when Echo Company deployed up there.
hold on a second. I'm gonna back up a little bit here. So, Chris, we were deployed on the second year of Iraqi Freedom,
Right.
Operation Iraqi Freedom, or OIF, together, but you were on the deployment prior to that, and this was the 2003. If people remember when we deployed over there in mass
Right.
and essentially invaded Iraq. I remember, I forgot that you were in a rifle company as a platoon commander, infantry rifle platoon commander, for that deployment. And you had a communications officer, I assume, that you had just gotten there, had the experience, they threw you right in, if I remember right. You started seeing the IEDs, or the improvised explosive devices, the roadside bombs, start to make their appearance.
That's correct. Yeah, we had, as part of Task Force Scorpion, there was a reconnaissance element that was up in our AO as well. I think that was the first vehicle that we had seen get hit with it was a soft shell Humvee at the time, but that was the first, one that I had seen. And then just the complexity of kind of the urban environment, that patrolling, environment where we were getting pot shots every day, RPGs, mortars. And so I knew that if we were going back, that was going to be more the environment that we had as opposed to what we did at our first deployment, which was very, very conventional in terms of our firepower and mobility. And this was going to be a different fight because we saw that, it was supposed to be security and stability operations when we were going to go back. SASO was this name that we were training for, and that quickly turned into a full-scale combat is when we got into Ramadi. And so to your point about how we were feeling beforehand, I just had a sense that the second go around was going to be a lot more complex, and it sure turned out to be in Ramadi.
I don't know what to make of a lot of these details that have just kind of dumped out of my memory long term. I do know, I remember specifically that there was one day, or maybe it was probably more than a day, but there was a time before we deployed that I know I really felt the tension and the stress leading up to it. I couldn't describe to you much more than that. I know you said SASO, so that was stability and security and stability operations. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Yeah, we had, so there was some really quick this is something the Marine Corps is really good at, is some really good quick lessons learned. The first year of the war, while that was still in progress, the units back in the States, when we realized we were going to keep rotating, start to rotate battalions and everybody through there, more than battalions, but start rotating units through there, adapted to training literally overnight and had some really good realistic training before going over there. Every Marine wonders what it's going to be like when you get shot at the first time. I mean, I remember I was in for 10 years to that point, and I feel comfortable saying for 10 years, that's kind of the main thing on your mind. You have all these different jobs. I was a platoon commander, company commander. I did a tour as an instructor. I was the monitor, manpower assignments. But through all that, you're wondering what's that going to be like the first time? What's your story? What about the first time?
I would say very similar, but I found one thing to be very true. And I saw this certainly after OIF-1. And that was the first time I had gotten shot at and returned fire and things of that nature. Um, the Marines and yourself, and you can't underscore this enough, really do fall back on their training. That those little things you learn, certainly when you're ready to kind of pull the trigger. I actually remember going through, before I was pulling the trigger, going through brass. But just what I noticed was, folks tend to fall back on their training rather than rise to occasions. And it really culminates when you now have to go do those kinds of things. So for me, I didn't dwell on that so much. I just kind of knew that I was trained, and being around other trained individuals kind of made you feel a lot safer.
That actually caused me a fair amount of stress during the deployment. That not being one of the guys out there
Yeah.
on the street every day. There was some really good inspiration for me later on to write about, which is and this could apply to anybody, but you gotta be conscious of who you idolize. So, the Marine Corps, it's the war hero, Chesty Puller, these combat leaders, Colonel Ripley, Bridget Dong Ha, Vietnam. And then if you're not careful, then, what happened to me, I don't know if this happened to you, you can tell me, but people developed a sense of what I should do when I'm in combat. And a lot of times, in my case, I was out there with the companies as needed. If they needed support, that was my job. You don't hear a lot of stories like that
Right.
of making sure that people got their supplies and making sure that they got what they need to live when they're not on patrol and things like that, which was my job. So that really kind of stressed me out pretty much the whole deployment, which I was not expecting. I think that translates over maybe a little bit to kind of like what you're saying with regard to clarity. You're leading people. You want to make sure people know what's expected of you, because as was in my case, they can really spend a lot of time worrying about if they're doing a good job or if they're doing what people are expecting them to do.
Yeah, Mike, I would say that was probably one of your greatest attributes, was the ability to trust your people, and 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 really your presence is a calming factor. As a
Oh,
as a senior leader in a battalion, among not just the young Marines, but even the junior officers as myself, just knowing, and you've always carried yourself with, a high degree of, I think, professionalism in the way that your demeanor comes across. That is an informal communications capability that I think, whether you knew it or not, resonates with folks because, whether you hit it well or not, the outward mask was one of, we've got a duty to do. We got, what do we got to do to fix a problem? It was always focused in on the task, which kept you from
yeah.
your mind drifting into things that didn't matter. And and certainly Colonel Newman did the same. And I think the whole staff operated like that. Even when we had some very bad days with high amounts of casualties, there was this sense of still calm, that we are still in control. And that in itself is a leadership attribute that isn't, I don't know that it's taught. It's probably more caught. And maybe that's the wisdom of being around the Corps for a long period of time. You kind of catch those things from other leaders. So for me,
Yeah.
I don't know that I really thought about it too much. I just know I wasn't negatively affected by, those kinds of things. And that means a lot in those uncertain environments.
Well, thanks for that, Chris. I can tell just by your comment there, I think these podcasts are going to do, that's really helpful for me to put things in perspective. 20 years ago, we're at 20 years now. We're getting everybody together, but I can just see it's not a Marine thing to say, here's how you made me feel. That's going to be a really good outcome of a lot of these talks, but I really appreciate you saying that. We had a lot of great leaders out there. I just talked to Colonel Newman last week about the reunion coming up. I just meant to give him like a 10, 15-minute update. We ended up talking for an hour about all these guys and who did what afterward and remember when this happened and when that happened. And why do you think this group, like you went on, you were a battalion commander, I was a battalion commander, you had other jobs, you worked with other great teams, I'm sure. I was with 1-1 and high point of my career, which is there's something about this 2-5 group. And we had guys with other combat deployments, but there's something about this 2-5 group that seems a little different. Do, do you feel that?
I do. In fact, I look at my time with 2-5, probably, although it was, although it was challenging in the ways that you would expect, it's the one that I kind of gravitate towards the most when I recollect what the Marine Corps meant for me. I had
Yeah.
10 years prior, but at the same time, there was something about 2-5's legacy, shared history, and I'll never forget in OIF-1, we were in March Air Force Base getting ready we were doing tank infantry integration. And I remember then Colonel Donahue and the staff from the warfighting lab laid out a map of Baghdad. And as officers, we all stood around this big table with a map talking about how we were going to attack Baghdad, right? Avenues of approach, where you're going to get canalized, all this stuff. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, my God, I am part of history right now. Like I'm literally writing the future. And this is before we even had we had inklings that we were going to deploy. And then you fast forward and you're in Ramadi. And by that time, I just felt such a connection, a shared connection to the history of 2-5 and its legacy and the fact that we were earning our place in the tapestry of that history real time every day, the weight of, I don't know about you, but the weight of the unit's legacy drove me towards mission accomplishment every single day, that I couldn't let down the ghosts from the past. And I don't know that I've been a part of another unit that I ever felt like that. And there's a lot of great units in the Marine Corps. Everybody thinks their battalion is the best battalion. We had an alchemy and a chemistry that was really special. And it was out of shared hardship, certainly, but that legacy, I think, went a long way.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned Colonel Adani, who was a battalion commander before Colonel Newman on our deployment that you deployed with on the first deployment. I remember him telling me the same thing. Is that you get this palpable feeling. 2-5 We keep saying 2-5, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. A regiment's about 5,000 guys. Battalion, think of it as 1,000. It's a little more, a little less. But the most decorated battalion in the Marine Corps, uh, I don't know if it still is. I suspect it probably is because, there is that picture behind you. Are those machine gunners from 2-5 by do you know?
Yeah, that's Bellawood as I
Okay.
look at it, but it still represents the same legacy.
Yeah, you know what I remember from, and help me put this in context for people, but before Iraq, as a platoon commander, company commander, and I spent a lot of time. I learned how to deal with this by the time I was a company commander. Put your flak jacket on, put your helmet on. We're on the range, and I'm sure the Marines felt a little nagged, micromanaged by the things that you just worried about in the 90s were just reversed
Yeah.
instantly. And, my recollection, the way I describe the impressions that guys made on me during that deployment is I use the word endurance, and you lived it and saw it, and your guys were part of this, as were you. But they, like you just said, day on stand every day, something going on. And so just to put it in real, to illustrate it for people, we deployed in August, spent about a month with 2-4, the previous battalion. They were in contact pretty regularly. Yeah. So the way I remember it is pretty much from mid-September to mid-November, pretty steady stream of fighting, and then kind of fell off. So that was what,
Phantom
September,
Fury.
3
Phantom
months,
Fury,
3 months.
up until about Phantom Fury, which is around November 10th, it was pretty much day on, stay on.
Oh, that makes sense. So we probably had a lot of the fighters going down there.
Well, I think either whoever stayed, those who left, I think came to Ramadi to fight, and then the rest of them stuck around Fallujah and took a nice ass beating from our brothers at 3-5 and others.
The, in Phantom Fury kicked off in November. Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that makes sense. Yeah. So I remember the way I thought of the guys was just the endurance these guys had every day. It was the opposite of the 90s platoon commander leadership that I went through, which was just nagging people about, like I said, put your flak jacket on. And you never had any to tell anybody that. So what did you take from that deployment forward? You're at the rest of your Marine Corps jobs and the ones you're in now.
That's funny. Kind of prepping for this call, I was kind of thinking a little bit about that. Like you, I grew up in the 90s Marine Corps, and I'd always been kind of a pusher. I was a
Yeah.
squad leader, platoon sergeant, acting platoon commander at times. I always was kind of pushing people, but as I look back, I was probably a lot more transactional in my leadership style,
Mhm.
meaning like, what are you doing was kind of the value of your worth. And I think after Ramadi, I became a lot more relational in my leadership style, that a person's worth is much greater than just kind of the tasks at hand and what they're doing. Ramadi was a lot of things for me, but one of them was a test of my faith. Um, and through my faith was how I tried to maintain my resilience and then breed that into my Marines the best that I could. And so that was kind of one of the things that I kind of took away from that experience was really focusing on the relationship, good or bad, whether a guy was a hitter or not a hitter. Their stock value was a hell of a lot higher because of who they were, not necessarily of what they did. for me personally. And I think that was one of the things I personally grew. Now keep in mind, I was an older lieutenant, probably should have learned that lesson a lot earlier, but um, but there were other things that were just they validated some of those old adages, things like, you know, lead by example, reputation matters, discipline in the small things means discipline in the big all those little adages kind of made they all were kind of validated for me too. Hard, realistic training. Um, really, I think for me, like a doctrine's written in blood, it's not like it's just made out of thin cloth. So in many ways, you can't duplicate those environments in peacetime, but you can lay the foundations. And to your point about the 90s, you're right. You kind of nagged people on these little disciplines. But the reality is those little disciplines kind of matter. In those later in actually during combat. And you do that stuff during peacetime so you don't have to nag during, because of combat, those things just become like, no shit, we gotta do that. You see a vehicle get blown up or a vehicle's blown up and you're there a few seconds later. Yeah, you're gonna keep your helmet and flak up. You don't have to tell people to do that kind of shit. Um, and I think there's a reason. It's hard to make people understand that. And so you're gonna naturally kind of be you know, the the assholes, so to speak, when it comes to those things. But I just found that those little things mattered. They didn't matter in the same amplitude, but they did matter. And
Yeah, in when we deployed to Afghanistan in 2012, our sergeant major, they had done a lot of talking with. He was a drill instructor background, which you always love working with those guys.
yeah,
But he had done a lot of talking with the sergeants major that had deployed previously, and the small disciplines. You're right. I mean, wearing your uniform correctly uh, was one of the big ones, and you might say, well, what does it matter if I roll my sleeves up a little bit or wear a scarf around my neck? Our first, I don't know if he was our first wounded guy, uh, but he had, there was an IED went off under the vehicle and the flames wrapped up around the sides of it. He was a turret gunner, and I guess pretty big IED. I don't remember if it disabled the vehicle, but his only wound was this scarf that we weren't supposed to wear, and he had it around his neck, and that thing caught fire and burned his neck. But yeah, the little things, because the little things turn into big things, and that's a good lesson for. I work in engineering now, and you're always balancing time and quality and things like that. And you never have enough time. You got to make good use of it toward in the right areas, which is kind of what we're talking about. Um, so what, maybe last, just to wrap up here, you're working with people who are starting out on their leadership path. Maybe it's a first time manager, or maybe it's not starting their leadership path, but they've been a manager, but they've never had somebody really talk to them about how to be a leader. What would you tell them?
I think the path to being a good leader is deciding that you want to be one. I mean, honest to God, so there's a tendency to kind of throw leadership around as kind of this big umbrella. The reality is, in my view, is that if you want to be a good leader, you just have to make the decision that you're going to be a good leader and follow the timeless principles. First, you got to know what they are. But, I had it once distilled down to me in kind of a trifecta that I thought was, a little bit of a ditty that you could use. But it effectively was know yourself, know your people, and know your shit. And knowing yourself meant where your strengths and weaknesses are. You focus on the things that you can do to develop your weaknesses, but, use your strengths and knowing your people's kind of like knowing what makes them tick. Everyone's individually different. Some people have different motivations and you got to go a little bit, a few layers deep than just their name and what they do. You got to get to know them and know what they're about and then knowing your stuff. I mean, nobody wants to follow somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And you got to be competent. And people will naturally follow competence. And so for me, I've just tried to, you know, so that's what I would tell somebody who doesn't really know where to step off. And I would say learning is a lifelong thing. So what you can't see behind this screen is a bookshelf full of other people's mistakes. And
Yeah.
good old General Mattis, the most important weapon is the 6 inches between your ears. That all those little things we hear. Don't certainly you can have great mentors. You can make a lot of mistakes and learn from them. I've done my fair share, continue to do so, but I can say I earnestly try to be a good leader for people, and that's just a daily choice. And that's probably I would tell people. And you can be self. I don't know. You gotta have to be there for other. Nothing shows you care like being there. And that for me is kind of what I just try to model. And guys like you and others that I've come across were those kinds of people. And so it's when you're in the Marine Corps, you see these examples every single day as living examples. In the civilian world, you may not have those types of examples. So you will inevitably you either have to become that example or try to find those folks that are doing it right. And that is a challenge sometimes, but it can be done. It's done every day.
Yeah, I like that. Choose to be a good leader. It's not you've seen people that it's about the promotion. It's about
Yeah.
more money. It's about the title. It's about other things. But if it's not about the people that you're leading, you're not going to be a leader. You'll be some overpaid management type who the way I put it out recently is, you go on the long list of forgettable corporate whoever.
Yeah.
It's you're not gonna be the person that the you're not gonna be somebody thinks back and says, "Oh, Chris really I had this one boss this time, Chris, and he paid a lot of attention to what was on my mind. He wanted to know what my pain points were,
Yeah.
and, he helped me with them, and he also knew about my family. He knew when my sister was in the hospital, and he took care of me and let me get out there, and, I think there's a whole kind of leader or manager, call it, that thinks, home is home and work is work, and the reality is especially these days, there's very little distinction between the 2.
I would agree. I think for folks that are out there, that are transitioning, they've all had good bosses and bad. They have maybe made some terrible mistakes as a leader themselves, and maybe they recognize it more now than ever. The great news is that when you do transition, it is a new start. It is an opportunity to really kind of apply the things that you may have not been able to for whatever reason or chose not to apply those good sound leadership principles that we know that works. And I know for me, some of my best bosses, they knew what my wife's name was. They knew how many kids I had. They knew where I was from. They knew more than just my rank and my name. And I try to do the same thing for my team now. And not to pat myself on the back, but I'm lucky to have in my particular role at Airbus, I got a great retired Army Sergeant Major, command Sergeant Major working for me. I've got a couple master sergeants that work for me and a few other great guys that wore our country's cloth. More often than not, they're very welcoming of that leadership style. And I think they care that I care about them. beyond just kind of their role at Airbus. And I don't know that that stops. Now it can get a little bit different in the civilian world where, why are you crying? That kind of thing. You just got to use your best judgment about how you do that. You know. Uh, but I think by and large, the more you kind of do that, the more I think loyalty is probably the word, but I think just the more trust you build, your trust bank account
Oh
grows,
yeah.
huge. When you call, when you find out somebody's sick in their family and those little things, and you just ask first and foremost, how's so and so doing? It's just the people side of the business, Mike. You know as well as I do that's what it's all about.
Yeah, trust, the way I explain it to people is if people don't trust you, they don't tell you things. So if you're fine making decisions with a incorrect understanding of what's going on, then don't worry about it. If you really want to know what's going on, though, you got to worry about building trust every day. Really appreciate you being on, Chris. Expect to get pulled in here as we get some more of these gunfighters lined up to talk about the
Yeah.
deployment and the battalion and what they're doing now. Until next time, 2-5 Leadership Podcast, Semper Fi, and Retreat Hell.